The black water swallowed her whole before she could scream. Josie Mercer sank into the freezing waters of Ashford Bay at 11:20 at night, 7 months pregnant, one shoe already lost on the rotting dock above. Her left hand cradled her belly by instinct, her right clawed upward for anything, a rock ledge, a steel bar, a reason not to let go. 7 hours ago, she was still a nurse. 5 hours ago, she still had a home. 3 hours ago, she still believed that doing the right thing meant the world would be fair in return. Now she was sinking, and the baby inside her kicked once as if it, too, was searching for the surface. Then a hand gripped her collar in the current, pulled hard, pulled against the tide, and didn't let go. The man who pulled her out was not a doctor, not a lifeguard, not anyone she had ever known. He was Griffin Blackwell, a name the entire city of Ashford knew, but no one dared speak after 10 at night. The man who controlled the entire eastern docklands, the kind of man who walked into a room and made it go silent not out of respect, but out of survival instinct. Josie didn't know any of that. Not yet. All she knew was that she was alive, and the man who had just saved her was looking at her with the eyes of someone who had once lost a person exactly like this, and this time, he wasn't going to let it happen again. But Griffin Blackwell never saved anyone without consequences, and Josie Mercer never owed anyone without paying it back. That night, on the shore of the bay, 2 soaking strangers sat side by side, and neither of them knew that this meeting would drag them both into something neither was ready for. If you want to know what happens next, hit like to support this story. Share this video with someone you think would love it too. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. 7 hours before the water swallowed her, Josie Mercer was still wearing her nurse's uniform, walking down the 3rd-floor hallway of Ashford General Hospital, the way she had every morning for the past 5 years. White shoes, hair tied high, her 7-month pregnant belly gently rounded beneath her blouse. Her shift began at 6 o'clock. She arrived at 5:45, as always, because Josie Mercer was never late. She put her bag in her locker, washed her hands, and checked the assignment board. Everything was normal, until the internal phone rang, and the secretary's voice said, "Josie, the director's office needs to see you, right now." Josie pushed open the director's office door and knew instantly, not because the air felt tense, not because of the look in the eyes of the person sitting behind the desk, but because there were 3 people in the room instead of 1. The hospital director sat in the middle. On the left was a woman wearing glasses, holding a folder stamped with the logo of the state health department. On the right was a man in a suit, the hospital's lawyer. 3 people, 3 faces. No one invited her to sit down. The director spoke first. He talked about an anonymous report, about an unlicensed clinic in the basement of an abandoned church on the south side of the city, about serious violations of medical procedure. He talked about the hospital's legal liability and the institution's public image. Each phrase fell like a brick, slowly building a wall between her and the life she had spent 5 years building. The health department had opened an investigation. Her nursing license was suspended immediately. The hospital was terminating her contract, effective today. Josie stood still, her back straight, her hands resting at her sides. She didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She listened to every word, took in every word. And when the director stopped, waiting for her reaction, Josie asked only one question. "The patients I'm following at the clinic, who's going to keep caring for them?" Silence. The woman from the health department looked down at the folder in her hands. The lawyer looked out the window. The director cleared his throat and said, "That is no longer your responsibility, Josie." She nodded. Once. Then she turned and walked out. The 3rd-floor hallway felt longer than she remembered. Or maybe it was as long as it had always been. Only today, each step carried more weight. Co-workers stood along both sides. Someone was changing a bandage. Someone was holding a clipboard. No one looked at her. No one said anything. She walked past the break room, where she had eaten lunch with her team hundreds of times. Nora, the woman whose shifts she had covered for 3 years, was standing in the break room doorway. When Josie passed, Nora turned her back, stepped inside, and closed the door. Not a word, not a glance. Josie kept walking, down the stairs, through the main lobby, out the front gate, 7 months pregnant. Backpack on her shoulder. One side of one shoe already torn from that morning because she had hurried to get to her shift. She stood outside the hospital gate, looking at the city she had served since she was a 22-year-old intern. 5 years. Thousands of shifts. Sleepless nights. Patients calling her name at 3 o'clock in the morning because she was the only one willing to listen. And now that same city stared back at her through the iron gate slowly closing behind her. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from her landlord. The hospital has informed me of your status. Your lease ends this weekend. Please move your things out before Saturday. Josie read the message twice. Then she turned off the screen, slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't cry. This kind of pain didn't come through tears. It came through silence. Through the feeling of the ground slowly pulling away beneath her feet, and she had to stand very still if she didn't want to fall in front of the people watching from behind the glass on the 3rd floor. She called Darcy. The phone rang 3 times. Josie? I need a place to stay tonight. Darcy didn't ask why. Didn't ask what had happened. She only said, "Come here." Josie went to Darcy's small apartment near the edge of the harbor district. Darcy opened the door, looked at her face, and said nothing except, "There's food in the fridge. There's a blanket in the living room. Rascal just chewed up one of my slippers, so be careful where you put your shoes." Josie almost laughed. Almost. That night, after Darcy had fallen asleep, Josie lay still on the sofa and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the 7 patients waiting for medicine at the clinic. Mrs. Whitfield, 63 years old, diabetic, with no insurance. Mr. Gentry, a veteran, whose old leg wound flared up every winter. A 19-year-old girl named June, 4 months pregnant, afraid to go to the hospital because she had no papers. Their medicine was still inside the clinic that had been sealed. No one would go get it for them. No one knew what they needed. Josie got up, took her backpack, opened the door very softly. Rascal lifted his head from the corner of the room, wagged his tail, and slipped out the door behind her before she could close it. Realizing she couldn't force him back inside without making a noise and waking Darcy, she had no choice but to let the puppy trot silently by her side. Duchess, the old one-eyed cat lying on top of the shoe cabinet, opened her eye and looked at them as if to say, "You know this is a terrible idea, don't you?" Josie knew. She went anyway, with the small dog at her heels. 7 months pregnant. At night, she climbed over the fence of the abandoned church and found her way down to the basement. The clinic had been taped off with a seal. She peeled the tape away, went inside, and took exactly what she needed. 4 boxes of insulin, 2 bags of antibiotics, 1 wound stitching kit, and 3 bottles of prenatal vitamins. She stuffed all of it into her backpack, closed the door again, and climbed out. The way back had to pass through the old harbor. The shortest route was across Pier Bridge No. 4. The bridge was rotten, and no one had used it in a long time. The railing on one side had already broken away. Josie stepped onto the bridge, the backpack heavy against her back, one torn shoe gripping poorly against the wet wood. She made it halfway across when her foot slipped. Her hand shot out, searching for the railing, but touched only empty air where the railing had been broken for years. And she fell. At the same time, less than 200 meters from Pier Bridge No. 4, Griffin Blackwell stepped out of warehouse No. 17 at the far end of the East Harbor. The meeting had just ended. 4 men had sat around an iron table for 1.5 hours to settle a problem that should have taken only 10 minutes, if they'd been smart enough to listen to him from the beginning. Griffin was tired. Not tired from lack of sleep, or from work. It was the kind of tired that belonged to a man who had grown too used to sitting in rooms full of people, where no one told the truth, and he had to calculate for himself who was lying, who was afraid, and who was quietly looking for a way to stab him in the back. Briggs had parked at the head of the pier, the headlights casting a yellow wash across the wet pavement. Griffin looked at the car, then at the road running along the bay. He chose to walk. It was always like that after tense meetings. Walking along the harbor near midnight, when there was no one left except the sound of the waves and the smell of salt, was the only way he knew to release the pressure no one could see, but that pressed down on his shoulders every day. He texted Briggs, "Wait at the pier. I'll walk back." Briggs didn't ask. After 12 years at his side, Briggs knew when to ask and when to stay quiet. Tonight was the kind of night for silence. Griffin had been walking for about 5 minutes when he heard it. Not the sound of waves, not the sound of fish thrashing, the sound of struggling, the sound of water being churned by something trying not to sink. It came from the direction of Pier Bridge No. 4, the rotten bridge everyone knew they shouldn't step onto, but no one had bothered to fence off. Griffin stopped, listened. The struggling didn't stop. and through the water, he heard breathing, fast and choked, the breathing of someone swallowing water and still trying not to let go. Griffin didn't think. He stripped off his coat, threw it onto the shore, set his phone beside it, and jumped in. Ashford Bay at night was colder than anything he had prepared himself for. The cold slammed into his chest, squeezed his lungs, and made his breath catch for half a second before instinct drove him toward the sound. The current was stronger than the surface showed. It dragged him off course, pulled him toward the open bay, and he had to kick constantly to hold his line. Then he saw her, not the image he had expected. He thought he'd see someone going under, someone thrashing in desperation, someone on the edge of giving up. But no, that woman was clinging to a jutting rock beneath the bridge with one hand, only one hand. Her other hand was wrapped around her belly, and she was pregnant. Her belly was large, unmistakable even in the darkness and black water. She didn't scream, didn't call for help. She only held on. Her fingers were white against the wet rock, her body being dragged again and again by the current, but she wouldn't let go, as if letting go was something she refused to do at any cost. Griffin swam to her. He caught the collar of her shirt with his right hand, while his left gripped the same rock she was holding. "I'm pulling you to shore," he said, his voice cut apart by the water. "Don't let go of the rock until I tell you." She didn't nod, but she heard him, because when he began to pull, she did something that surprised him. She didn't just let him drag her. She kicked on her own, searching for footing on the rocks beneath the surface, then used that force to push both of them toward shore. Her foot found a hold his couldn't find. She knew how to use the current instead of fighting it. In 30 chaotic seconds between black water and slick concrete, she wasn't the one being rescued. She was the one saving herself, and he was the one helping her finish it. They reached shore. Both of them lay on the wet concrete, gasping, soaked from head to toe. Griffin lay on his back, staring up at a starless sky, hearing his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Beside him, the woman lay on her side, her hand resting on her belly. She was silent. 3 seconds. Then she breathed out, her voice hoarse from swallowing water, still kicking. Griffin turned his head and looked at her. For the first time, he saw her clearly, hair plastered to her face, lips pale from cold, eyes red, her pregnant belly large beneath her soaked clothes, and on her back, the backpack was still there. He looked at the backpack, then at her. "You nearly drowned and still wouldn't let go of that backpack?" Josie sat up slowly, one hand still holding her belly. "There's medicine in it." "What kind of medicine?" "Insulin, antibiotics, vitamins." She looked at him, her eyes fully alert even though she had almost died. "For people without insurance, without anyone to take care of them, like me right now." Griffin looked at her. This woman, 7 months pregnant, had climbed a fence at night to get medicine for other people, had fallen into freezing water, had clung to a rock with one hand, and the first thing she said once she reached shore wasn't "thank you," but still kicking. He had met many kinds of people in his life, people who risked their lives for money, for power, for fear. But the kind who risked their life for insulin for strangers, he had never met before. He sat up, picked up his phone from beside his coat on the shore, and called Briggs. "Bring the car to Pier Bridge number 4. A second of silence. "Bring extra blankets." On the other end, Briggs stayed quiet for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to understand this wasn't an ordinary request, then said, 3 minutes. 3 minutes later, the headlights of the black car swept across the bayfront. Briggs stepped out, looked at Griffin soaked to the skin, looked at the pregnant woman curled on the concrete, looked at the little pit bull running around her and barking wildly because he didn't understand what had happened. Briggs didn't ask. He opened the trunk, took out a blanket, and handed it to Griffin. Griffin didn't take it for himself. He wrapped the blanket around Josie's shoulders first, then stood, wet and cold, and walked toward the front seat. Josie sat in the back seat, the blanket wrapped around her, Rascal lying at her feet and trembling. She looked at the back of the man's head in the front seat. His black shirt clung to his back, his shoulders broad, his hair wet, his face pointed straight ahead, never turning around. She didn't know who he was, didn't know what he did, didn't know why he had jumped into cold water in the middle of the night for a stranger. She only knew one thing. He had wrapped the blanket around her before he wrapped one around himself. And out of everything she had lost today, That small detail was the first thing that almost made her cry. Josie opened her eyes and didn't know where she was. A high ceiling, yellow lights, gray concrete walls. Not the hospital, not Darcy's apartment, not anywhere she had ever known. She was lying on a single bed, under a clean blanket, with a soft pillow beneath her head, and the clothes on her body were dry, but they weren't hers. Someone had changed her into an oversized t-shirt and soft fabric pants. She sat up slowly, her pregnant belly pulling her center of gravity forward, and the first thing she saw was Darcy. Darcy was sitting on an iron chair beside the bed, one leg tucked up, both hands around a paper cup, dark circles under her eyes but fully awake. "You're up," Darcy said, her voice gentle, though her eyes checked Josie from head to toe in the way of someone who had learned it during her years as a social worker. "Before you ask, I'll give you the quick version. The man who pulled you onto shore last night sent someone to my apartment around almost 1 o'clock in the morning. That person said his boss needed me to come here. I brought Duchess because that cat refused to stay home alone. Rascal was already here. Apparently he followed you down to the pier." Josie looked down toward the foot of the bed. Rascal lay curled on the concrete floor, his tail wagging weakly when he saw she was awake. Duchess sat on the iron shelf in the corner of the room, her fur white and gray, one eye watching Josie with the look of someone who had lived long enough to be surprised by nothing anymore. Then Josie looked across the room. About 4 meters away, a man was sitting with his back against the wall. Black shirt, dry now, different from the soaked one she remembered from last night. That meant he had changed clothes, which meant he had been here long enough to change, which meant he hadn't left after bringing her here. His hands held a paper cup of coffee, his eyes stared straight ahead, his face expressionless, as if sitting in a warehouse at dawn with a pregnant stranger was something he did every day. And at his feet, Rascal was asleep on one of his shoes. The puppy was 5 months old and weighed less than 4 kilograms, yet he had chosen a stranger's shoe as his pillow, and that stranger didn't seem bothered. "Who are you?" Josie asked. Her voice was hoarse from the bay water and too little sleep. The man looked at her, blue-gray eyes, the kind she couldn't read anything from. "The man who pulled you out of the water last night. I know that. I'm asking who you are." "Griffin." That was all. No last name, no title. Just a name, offered like a card placed face down on the table. Josie looked around the room. High ceiling, concrete walls, a thick iron door at the end of the hallway. Through the small window, she saw a yard outside with 2 men in dark clothes standing beside a black car. They didn't look like apartment security. They stood like men who knew how to watch and knew how to act if necessary. "Is this a house or a warehouse?" she asked. "Depends on how you look at it. Is the door locked?" Griffin looked at her, longer than before. Then he said, "No. You want to leave? You leave." Josie looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them gave way. Darcy sat between them, her eyes moving from one to the other, with the expression of someone watching 2 cats sniff each other for the first time. At last, Josie turned to Darcy. "What do you know about him?" Darcy took a sip of coffee. "I asked the driver named Briggs. He said exactly 2 words. My boss. Then nothing else. I kept asking, and he looked at me like, 'You've asked enough.' Josie, I don't think this place is a charity shelter." Josie knew that. She looked at the thick iron door, at the 2 men in the yard, at the way Griffin sat. The way he sat wasn't the way ordinary people sat, while waiting for a guest to wake up. It was the way a man sat when he was used to controlling a space, a man who knew every exit, every blind corner, and had chosen the seat with the widest view of the room. She had seen that kind of posture before in certain patients in the emergency room, people who came in with wounds they couldn't explain and left before the police arrived. She knew where she was, or at least, she knew she was somewhere that wasn't normal. But she also knew this. Outside that iron door, she had no home, no job, no family, and her belly was carrying a baby who would be born in about 2 months. That baby needed shelter more than his mother needed pride. Josie Mercer could accept sleeping on the street, but her child couldn't. "I'm staying," she said. Not as a plea, not as a request for permission. She said it like someone laying down terms she had already decided for herself. "But I need to know 3 things. 1. The door isn't locked, exactly as you said. 2. Darcy stays with me. 3. No one touches my backpack." Griffin looked at her. Then he stood, careful not to wake Rascal, even though the dog was still lying on his shoe. "The door isn't locked. Your friend is already here, and your backpack is on that table." No one opened it. He walked toward the door, stopped, and didn't turn around. "There's food in the cabinet. Bathroom's at the end of the hallway. The hot water takes about 2 minutes to come up." Then he walked out. Josie watched him through the window. In the yard, Griffin stopped beside Briggs. The two men spoke in low voices, their faces serious. Briggs nodded again and again. Griffin said little. Briggs listened more. Then Griffin walked away, and Briggs watched him go with the expression of someone who had been doing this for 12 years and still didn't fully understand his own boss. "Josie," Darcy said from the chair. Her voice was smaller now. "Are you sure?" Josie was still looking out at the yard. Griffin had disappeared around the corner of the wall. The two men in dark clothes were still standing there, motionless. Rascal had woken up on the floor and was sniffing the shoe he had been sleeping on, as if trying to understand why a stranger's shoe had felt so warm and so perfectly right. "He jumped into the water," Josie said. She didn't turn her head, didn't explain further, didn't defend it. It was simply the only fact she had in her hands right now, and she was using it to convince herself that staying here wasn't the biggest mistake of her life. Or if it was a mistake, then at least her child would sleep in a bed with a blanket instead of on a park bench. And tonight, that much was enough. The second day at the safe house began with Rascal scratching at the door, demanding to go outside at 6 o'clock in the morning. Josie opened the bedroom door and led the dog out to the backyard, where a bare patch of concrete sat between two old warehouses. In the early morning, the harbor district was quieter than she had expected. The distant sound of waves, the cries of seagulls, the smell of salt mixed with the rusty scent of iron from abandoned steel frames. Darcy was still asleep. Duchess was still sitting on the iron shelf, watching the world with the attitude of someone who had retired and had no intention of going back to work. Griffin was nowhere to be seen. The black car was still parked outside in the yard, Briggs standing beside it, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes sweeping the area out of habit. He gave Josie one nod when she stepped out. He said nothing. Josie nodded back. She said nothing either. That was the whole exchange between them. And somehow, it was enough. Josie spent the morning checking the backpack of medicine again, sorting it, making notes, calculating how many days it would last. She ate breakfast from bread and peanut butter in the cabinet, giving Rascal a piece that the dog swallowed before he could even chew. She showered, and the hot water truly did take about 2 minutes to come up, exactly as Griffin had said. She changed into the loose clothes someone had left ready in the bathroom. They weren't women's clothes, and they were too large, but they were clean and dry. She didn't ask whose clothes they were. Some questions didn't need answers when the answer wouldn't change anything about the situation. Near noon, she heard voices, not from inside the safe house, from the warehouse next door, separated from her room by one concrete wall and an iron door left slightly open. Griffin's voice. She recognized it immediately because she had heard it twice before, once underwater when he said, "Don't let go of the rock," and once in the room when he said, "The door isn't locked." But this voice was different. Lower, slower, more even, like a man counting every word before letting it fall, and knowing exactly where each word would land. And there was a second voice. Another man. That voice was trembling. Josie knew she shouldn't go toward it. She knew that very well. She was a stranger in a stranger's house, 7 months pregnant, with no right here except the right to be given temporary shelter for the night. But Josie Mercer had never been good at doing what she should do. She was good at doing what she needed to do, and right now, she needed to know. She walked down the hallway, stepping lightly, stopping in front of the iron door left ajar. Inside, beneath the dull yellow light, she saw a man sitting on an iron chair, his back bent, his face pale. Sweat dotted across his forehead even though the space wasn't hot. Across from him, Griffin sat in an armchair, one leg crossed over the other, both hands resting on his thighs, his face calm, as if they were talking about the weather. Griffin spoke. She couldn't hear every word clearly through the concrete wall, only the rhythm of his voice. Even, low, unbroken. After every sentence Griffin said, the other man's shoulders curled in a little more, as if each sentence were a layer of clothing being stripped away, leaving him more and more exposed before something he didn't want to face. Griffin didn't raise his voice, didn't slam the table, didn't stand up. He only sat there and spoke, quietly, evenly, and the other man shook harder after every sentence. Then Griffin stopped. Silence. The man sat there for a few more seconds, as if waiting for one more sentence that never came. Then he stood, lowered his head, didn't look at Griffin, and walked out through the back door. His steps were heavier than when he had come in. Much heavier, like someone carrying something invisible that he couldn't put down. He wasn't injured, not scratched. There was no sign that anything physical had happened in that room. But the way he walked told Josie that whatever had happened in there was heavier than any wound she had ever stitched in the emergency room. Josie didn't hide. She didn't step back. She didn't run to her room and pretend she hadn't seen anything. When Griffin came out into the hallway, he saw her standing right there, less than 2 meters from the warehouse door. Her back straight, her hands at her sides, her eyes looking directly into his. Not afraid, not curious, just clear. Griffin stopped. Something passed through his eyes, so fast that if Josie hadn't been an emergency nurse used to reading faces in a split second, she would have missed it. Surprise. Not surprise because she was there, but because she was there and didn't look away from him. "What were you talking to that man about?" Josie asked. "You don't need to know. I'm living under your roof. My child is going to be born near here. I need to know what kind of person I'm standing beside." Griffin looked at her, for a long time. Not the kind of look meant to threaten or calculate. It was the look of a man seeing something he didn't meet often, and hadn't yet decided what it was. Then he said, "He stole from me. I gave him 2 choices. Return it, or leave the city. He just made his choice. Did you threaten his family?" That question changed something in the air. Only a little. But it did. Griffin looked at her differently, as if she had just stepped across a line most people didn't even know existed. "No," he said. His voice went 1 degree colder, but not cold toward her. Cold toward the question, toward the idea itself, as if it had touched something he considered non-negotiable. "I don't touch families, ever." Josie weighed that answer. She didn't say, "I believe you." She didn't say, "I don't believe you," either. She nodded once, turned around, and walked down the hallway toward her room. Her steps were steady. Her back was straight. She didn't look back. Behind her, Briggs stepped in from the yard outside. He had been standing there long enough to hear the last part of the conversation. Briggs looked at Griffin, then looked toward Josie as she faded down the end of the hallway. 12 years I've been here," Briggs said, his voice low. "No one has ever asked you that, not even me." Griffin didn't answer. He stood in the hallway, watching her until she turned into her room and closed the door. He looked longer than necessary, longer than a boss watching a temporary guest, longer than a stranger watching another stranger. Then he turned, walked out into the yard, and said nothing more to Briggs for the rest of the noon hour. That night, Josie lay in the room, the blanket pulled up to her chest, Rascal curled beneath the foot of the bed, Duchess lying on the iron shelf like a statue made of fur. Josie stared at the ceiling and thought. She was in the house of a dangerous man. She knew that as clearly as she knew a normal heart rate was 60 to 100 beats per minute. That man spoke softly and made other people tremble. That man had 2 men standing guard outside in the yard, and a right-hand man of 12 years who hadn't dared ask the question she had just asked. But that man had also jumped into cold water for her. And when she asked whether he threatened other people's families, his voice had gone cold, not because he was angry that she asked, but because the question touched a line he didn't allow anyone to cross, not even himself. She didn't yet know how strong that line was, didn't yet know whether it would hold when the pressure grew heavy enough, but she would find out, because the child in her belly had no choice except to trust his mother, and his mother was choosing to stay here. Josie Mercer would find out. She always found out. The following days passed in a strange rhythm Josie hadn't expected to get used to. In the mornings, she woke early, checked the medicine in the backpack, ate breakfast, and took Rascal out to the yard. Darcy worked remotely on her old laptop, managing the harbor warehouse through emails and phone calls, occasionally muttering curses under her breath because the warehouse Wi-Fi kept cutting in and out. Duchess claimed the highest iron shelf in the room and refused to come down for any reason, including food. Griffin came every day, sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon, never with warning. He came in, said a few words to Briggs, checked something on his phone, then sat in the corner of the main room and did his own work. He didn't ask how she was, didn't start conversations, but every day, something in the safe house changed. On the 3rd day, the iron chair beside Josie's bed disappeared. In its place was a chair with a backrest, with a cushion, comfortable enough for a woman 7 months pregnant to sit in without her back hurting after 10 minutes. Josie looked at the chair. Then she looked over at Griffin, sitting in the corner, his face half lost in the glow of his phone screen. She said nothing. He said nothing. The chair sat between them like a question no one had asked and no one answered. On the 4th day, the medicine cabinet in the bathroom had an added box of prenatal vitamins. Josie opened the box, checked the ingredients and dosage. The right kind, the right stage of pregnancy. She looked at that box of vitamins for a long time. Someone had needed to find out how far along she was, what kind of vitamins were suitable, and what dosage was right. Someone had needed to look it up, or ask someone who knew. Josie set the box down and didn't ask. On the 5th day, the bathroom had a new grab bar. Steel, bolted firmly into the concrete wall, placed exactly where a pregnant woman would need to hold on while rising from the bathtub. Josie stood in the bathroom, looking at the grab bar, then stepped out into the main room, where Griffin was sitting and reading something on his phone. "You fixed the bathroom," she said. Griffin didn't look up. "The floor is slippery. You installed a grab bar. The floor is very slippery." Josie stood there, arms folded across her chest, her pregnant belly rising between them. "You're taking care of me and pretending you aren't." Griffin finally looked up. His face was expressionless. "The floor really is slippery." From the next room, Darcy's voice floated out, loud enough for both of them to hear clearly. "Oh my God, just get married already." Josie turned her head toward Darcy's room. "Shut up." "Never," Darcy said, and the sound of her keyboard started up again, as if what she had just said was only a tiny footnote in an ordinary workday. Griffin didn't react. He looked back down at his phone, and Josie realized the tips of his ears were a little redder than usual. Maybe it was the light. Maybe it wasn't. She didn't ask anything more. She went back to her room, took the vitamin, and sat in the cushioned chair that no one admitted belonged to anyone. Griffin never asked who the baby's father was, didn't ask what she planned to do after giving birth, didn't ask where her family was, why no one had come looking for her, or why a woman 7 months pregnant had been wandering alone across a rotten pier bridge in the middle of the night. He didn't ask anything personal, not one question. But every day, the safe house changed a little. Always something small, something practical, something exactly right for what she needed, before she had even said it aloud, as if someone was reading her list of needs from a distance and silently crossing off each item. On the 7th day, Josie went outside the safe house for the first time. Not alone. Griffin assigned Briggs to go with her every time she stepped past the gate. Josie didn't like that. She said to Briggs, "I don't need a babysitter." Briggs replied, his face unmoving. "I don't like babysitting either. But my boss says go, so I go." Josie looked at him. He looked back. She sighed and kept walking. Briggs walked behind her, exactly 3 steps away, no closer, no farther, as if he had measured the precise distance that was enough to protect without invading. They walked along the old harbor district. Josie looked around at the small breakfast shops, the net repair store, the corner coffee stand, workers, street vendors, old men sitting at the edge of the pier with fishing rods. Normal, until she saw 2 large men standing in front of a small grocery store. The owner was an elderly woman with silver hair, standing behind the counter, her face tight with tension. The 2 men were saying something Josie couldn't hear clearly, but she recognized the posture. Leaning forward, taking up space, the stance of people pressuring someone else without needing to touch them. She had seen that stance dozens of times in the emergency room, where patients' relatives tried to force her to do things that weren't allowed by procedure. Josie hadn't even had time to say anything before Briggs stepped forward. He didn't run, didn't shout. He simply walked up, stood beside the black car, and folded his arms. Not a single word. The 2 men turned, saw Briggs, and their reaction told Josie everything she needed to know. Their faces went pale, their eyes dropped. They stepped back twice, then turned and left so quickly it was almost a run. The old woman behind the counter let out a breath and gave Briggs one short nod, the kind of familiar nod that said this had happened before and would happen again. Josie looked at Briggs. "What was that?" Briggs looked at her, considered for 1 second, then said, "My boss's rule. In this district, no one gets forced. No one gets money taken from them unless they agree. Whoever does otherwise deals with the consequences." That was all. 3 sentences. Briggs returned to his place, 3 steps behind Josie, and kept walking. Josie looked at the old woman behind the counter, looked at the two men now gone at the end of the street, looked at the harbor district with its little shops, its workers, its ordinary faces, living ordinary lives, under the shadow of a man no one dared name after 10 o'clock at night. That evening, while Griffin sat in the corner of the main room, Josie sat across from him, 4 meters away as always. "I went through the harbor district today," she said. Griffin didn't look up. "I know. Briggs handled 2 men making trouble at the grocery store. All he had to do was stand there. Didn't say anything. Briggs is good at standing there. Do you protect the harbor because you care about them, or because it's your territory?" Griffin stopped looking at his phone. He looked at her. "Is there a difference?" "Yes," Josie said. "A very big one." He looked at her longer than a simple answer required. Then he said, his voice quieter than usual, "At first, it was territory. Now it's more complicated." "When did it become complicated?" Griffin looked out the window. He didn't answer. Josie didn't push. She stood, returned to her room, and stopped at the hallway window to look out over the harbor district under the night lights. Low rooftops, weak yellow lamps, shadows of people moving through narrow alleys. Griffin's world, his power, his darkness. And somehow, that world was protecting the exact people whom the clean, lawful, procedural world of Ashford General Hospital had abandoned. The elderly woman at the grocery store had no one protecting her except Griffin Blackwell's shadow. The patients in the church basement had no one caring for them except Josie Mercer. And now Josie herself was standing in that same shadow, sheltered by the kind of power whose dark side she had seen through a half-open door yesterday. She didn't know whether that made her feel safer or more afraid. Maybe both. And maybe, for now, both were enough. Lawson Merrick arrived at the safe house on the afternoon of the 10th day. Without warning, without calling, without asking permission. He walked through the iron gate like a man stepping into his own home, both hands in his pants pockets, his gray suit cut perfectly to his frame, his hair brushed back, a smile already placed on his face before the door even opened. Behind him, a young woman followed, her hair pinned in a low bun, a folder held against her chest, her eyes lowered. Briggs stood outside in the yard and saw Lawson before Lawson saw him. He didn't block him, didn't ask questions, only texted Griffin and stood still. Josie was sitting in the main room, sorting the medicine in her backpack for the 3rd time that week, when she heard footsteps and looked up to see a man she had never met walking in, with a smile she recognized immediately. Not a warm smile, a precise smile, the kind of smile practiced to land in the right place, at the right time, hiding exactly what needed to be hidden. She had seen that kind of smile on the faces of doctors preparing to tell a patient's family that they had done everything they could, when the truth was that they hadn't done enough. Griffin appeared from the back hallway, entering the main room without hurry. He looked at Lawson. Lawson looked at him. No one greeted anyone. No one shook hands. The kind of silence that existed between two people who knew each other too well to need politeness. "Lawson," Griffin said. "Just the name." "No hello." "No, it's been a while." "Just the name," in a flat voice. "Griffin." Lawson's smile widened. Then his eyes swept across the room and stopped on Josie, stopped on her pregnant belly. His smile didn't change, but his eyes did. They assessed, measured, classified. Josie felt that look like someone laying a hand on her shoulder without her permission. She wanted to step back. She didn't. Lawson turned to Griffin, his voice gentle, as if he were asking after someone's health. "I hear you have a guest. A nurse, under investigation by the health department, pregnant, no family, nowhere willing to take her in. You're using the safe house, using Briggs, using organization resources for this." He tilted his head, still smiling. "How do you think the council will see it?" Griffin didn't answer. His face was as flat as water before a storm. Josie looked at him, looked at Lawson, and began fitting the pieces together. A cousin, another branch of the organization, someone with the authority to raise questions before the council. Not a friend, not an open enemy, something more dangerous than both. Then Lawson lowered his voice, still smiling, but his tone turned half a degree colder, just enough for Josie to catch the change even from 4 meters away. "You've always had this habit, Griffin, picking up broken things and convincing yourself this time will be different." He paused, letting the next sentence fall more slowly. "Back then, it was the person you couldn't save. Now it's this nurse. You already know how it ends. Josie didn't know who the person you couldn't save was, but she knew what that sentence did. She looked at Griffin. His face didn't change. Not one crease, not one blink. But his hand, at his right side, clenched, slowly. 5 fingers curled into his palm, tightening until the knuckles went white. The rest of his body stayed perfectly still, perfectly controlled, but that hand told Josie everything his face concealed. That sentence had touched a place Griffin didn't let anyone near, and Lawson knew it. He had aimed exactly there. Josie stepped forward. No one invited her. No one told her to. She moved from her seat into the middle of the room, stood between Griffin and Lawson, and looked straight into the face of the smiling man. "You just used the dead to jab at the man standing in front of you," she said. Her voice was even, neither rising nor falling. The voice she used with patients' families in the emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning. The kind of voice with no room for excess emotion. "I don't need to know anyone's family history. I only need to know what kind of person does that." Lawson lost his smile. Only for half a second. So fast most people wouldn't have noticed. But Josie wasn't most people. She had spent 5 years reading faces in an instant, telling the difference between an ordinary stomachache and a ruptured appendix, just by looking into a patient's eyes, and she saw that half second as clearly as she saw the light above them. "I've met enough kinds of people in the emergency room at 3 o'clock in the morning," she continued, her eyes never leaving Lawson. "The most dangerous kind isn't the person who causes the injury. The most dangerous kind is the person who walks into the patient's room with a smile and asks after their health, while still hiding something behind their back." She stopped. "You're that kind." The room went silent. Griffin looked at Josie. Something shifted in his eyes, small and deep, like a pane of glass turning slightly and letting light into a place that had held only shadow before. Lawson withdrew his smile completely and looked at Josie as if reassessing her from the beginning. "You're very interesting, Miss Mercer," he said. "I'm not trying to be interesting," Josie replied. "I'm trying to be clear." Behind Lawson, the young woman holding the folder had stood motionless from the start. Josie looked at her, and the woman looked back. That look wasn't contempt. It wasn't curiosity. Josie recognized it immediately, because she had seen it hundreds of times on the faces of women who came into the emergency room with bruises they explained as a fall down the stairs. That look was fear, not fear of Josie. Fear for Josie, or fear for herself. Josie remembered that look. Lawson left after 10 minutes. He walked out through the iron gate with steps as light as when he had entered, the young woman following behind him. The smile had returned to his face, perfect, properly placed, hiding exactly what needed to be hidden. The gate closed. The car drove away. Griffin stood in the main room, silent. His hand had opened again, but it still hung at his side, as if it didn't yet know what to do after having clenched too tightly. Josie didn't ask. She went into the small kitchen at the end of the hallway, made a cup of coffee, carried it out, and set it on the iron table in front of him. Then she pulled out a chair and sat beside him. She said nothing. She just sat there. The silence stretched. Rascal lay beneath the table, his head resting on Josie's foot. Duchess looked down from the iron shelf with the expression of someone who had known what would happen before it happened. Then Griffin spoke. He didn't look at Josie. He looked at the cup of coffee. "I once had a younger sister. Her name was Molly." His voice was low, flat, asking for no pity. "My family had nothing back then. No papers, no money, no one we knew." He stopped. "Molly got sick, and I couldn't find anyone to treat her in time." A pause. Nothing more. There was no need. The emptiness after that last sentence said more than any detail he could have added. Josie sat still. She didn't say, "I understand," because she knew no one ever truly understood another person's grief. She didn't say, "I'm sorry," because sorry changed nothing, and Griffin wasn't the kind of man who needed to hear it. She only said, "That's why you jumped into the water." Not a question. Griffin looked at her. For the first time since she had met him, his eyes weren't the kind she couldn't read. This time, she could read them. And what she read was relief. The relief of a man who had just spoken aloud something he had carried for a very long time, and the person sitting in front of him didn't need him to explain more, didn't need him to tell the details, didn't need him to prove anything. She only listened, nodded, and said one sentence that showed she understood, not with reason, but with instinct. Griffin lifted the cup of coffee, took a sip. Briggs stood at the corner of the hallway, far enough away not to hear clearly. but close enough to see that for the first time in 12 years, Griffin Blackwell drank something from another person's hand without looking at it twice. That night, Josie lay in her room, one hand on the blanket, eyes open, staring at the concrete ceiling. She thought about Molly, whom she had never met and would never meet. She thought about Griffin as a boy, unable to find anyone to help his little sister, carrying that through every year until it had become part of his body, like bone, like blood, like the way he always sat facing the door. And she thought that maybe, just maybe, the reason he installed the grab bar in the bathroom for her, the reason he left the box of vitamins in the medicine cabinet, the reason he jumped into freezing water in the middle of the night for a pregnant woman whose name he didn't know, wasn't only because the floor was slippery, wasn't only because the water was cold. It was because this time, he didn't want to stand on the shore and watch one more person sink while he could do nothing. This time, he jumped. Lawson didn't waste time. 3 days after that afternoon at the safe house, Griffin received word from Briggs. The organization's council had been called into an emergency meeting. Griffin wasn't the one who called it. Lawson had pushed for it. The official reason was reviewing this quarter's internal resource allocation. The real reason was something everyone in the organization knew, but no one said aloud, because saying it aloud meant choosing a side, and no one wanted to choose a side before knowing which side would win. Briggs gave Griffin the news early in the morning, the two of them standing outside in the safe house yard, their voices low. Josie sat in the main room and caught 2 words through the half-open window: council and tonight. She looked at Darcy. Darcy looked back, her eyes narrowing. Sounds like the kind of meeting we're not supposed to know about. Josie said nothing, but she listened, and she thought. That evening, Griffin put on a black shirt, buttoned his cuffs, and stepped out to the car. Briggs drove. Josie stood at the window, watched the car leave, and made her decision in exactly 4 seconds. She turned to Darcy. "Watch Rascal for me." Darcy opened her mouth as if to say something, but Josie was already walking toward the door. She called the only taxi whose number she knew in the Harbor District, gave the address of the restaurant she had heard Briggs mention that morning, and sat in the back seat with her 7-month pregnant belly, an oversized t-shirt, soft fabric pants, and the shoes Darcy had lent her because one side of her own pair was still torn. The private restaurant was closed to the public and located on the 2nd floor of an old building near the ferry dock. Josie climbed the stairs and passed 2 men standing guard at the door. They looked at her pregnant belly, then looked at each other. One of them lifted a hand. "You're not on the list." Josie looked at him. "I'm the person this meeting is about. So if you want to stop me, you'll have to explain to your boss why you blocked a pregnant woman on the stairs." The 2 men looked at each other again. Then they stepped aside. Josie pushed open the heavy wooden door and walked in. A long room, a long wooden table, low-hanging lights. 11 people sat around the table, most of them men, most of them in suits or dark shirts, most of them with the faces of people who had sat at tables like this too many times to be impressed by anything anymore. Margot Hale sat at the head of the table, silver hair, thin-framed glasses, a pen in her hand over a folder. Lawson sat in the middle on the right, his back against the chair, his face calm. Griffin sat across from Lawson, his face flatter than the tabletop. When Josie walked in, every conversation stopped. 11 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and Griffin, not turning his head because he was sitting across from the door and had seen her from the moment it began to open, said, "I don't remember inviting you." Josie looked at him. "I don't remember asking." Something passed across Griffin's face, so fast only Josie noticed it. Not anger, almost the opposite. Then he turned back to the table without another word, and Josie pulled out the empty chair at the end of the table, sat down, and placed both hands on the tabletop, as if she had been sitting at tables like this her whole life. Lawson began, his voice smooth, every word carefully chosen. "The council needs to assess whether the person in charge is allocating organization resources for personal purposes, and whether that creates risk." He didn't say Josie's name. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about when his eyes passed over her and returned to Griffin. Harlan, the large man seated at the far left end of the table, from the Southern District, stood up. His voice was louder than the room required. "I'll speak plainly. You're letting some nameless nurse manipulate the organization, using the safe house, using Briggs, using our money. This is weakness, Blackwell, and this organization has no room for weakness." The room went still. Everyone looked at Griffin. Griffin didn't stand. He remained seated, leaning back, looking at Harlan. Not blinking. The silence stretched long enough for Josie to count her own heartbeat. 5 beats, 6 beats, 7 beats. Sweat began to bead on Harlan's forehead even though the room wasn't hot. Then Griffin spoke, his voice quieter than anyone else's in the room, so quiet that everyone had to lean forward to hear him. Harlan, last month, the Southern District lost 2 shipments. I know where they disappeared. A pause. I know who took them. Another pause. Do you want me to keep going, or do you want to sit down? Harlan sat down, fast, as if the chair had magnets in it. No one in the room said another word for the next 3 seconds, and those 3 seconds were all it took for everyone in the room to remember why Griffin Blackwell sat in that chair, and they sat in theirs. Then Josie stood. She didn't ask permission. She stood and began to speak, in the even voice she had used for 5 years in the emergency room, a voice with no room for panic or drama, only truth. I'm Josie Mercer. I was an emergency nurse for 5 years at Ashford General. I was fired for running a free clinic for people the medical system abandoned. I didn't come here to ask anyone for pity. I came because you're discussing me without me in the room, and I don't accept that. She looked around the table, face by face. You want to know whether I'm a burden or not? I kept an uninsured veteran alive for 2 years with medicine I bought myself. I delivered 3 women's babies in a church basement at 3 o'clock in the morning because they were too afraid to go to the hospital. I'm not a burden. I'm the only person willing to do the things no one else is willing to do. The room went silent. Josie sat down. Griffin looked at her, then looked at the council. He said one sentence, his voice still quieter than everyone else's. If the council has a problem with someone keeping abandoned people alive, then the problem is with the council, not with her. At the head of the table, Margot Hale looked at Griffin, looked at Josie, then looked down at the folder. She wrote something in slow strokes of her pen, then said, The council takes note. Miss Mercer remains at the safe house under organization supervision. We'll reassess after 30 days. Not a victory, but not a defeat. A compromise. The kind of compromise where the winner doesn't yet know they've won, and the loser hasn't yet admitted they've lost. Lawson nodded, his smile returning. Perfect. Properly placed. But his eyes were different when he looked at Josie. No longer assessing. Calculating. Outside the restaurant, the Ashford Bay night was cold and salty. Josie stood on the sidewalk, breathing, her pregnant belly rounded beneath the streetlight. Griffin stepped out behind her, Briggs following. You owe me a thank you, Josie said, not turning around. Griffin stopped beside her. You just walked into a room full of the most powerful people in Ashford Bay without being invited. Correct, Josie said, turning to look at him. And I walked out in one piece. A thank you would be very appropriate right now. Griffin looked at her. His face was still flat, but the corner of his mouth shifted upward, small, quick, almost nothing. Almost. Not a smile, but the closest thing Griffin Blackwell allowed himself to show in front of other people. Then he walked toward the car, opened the back door for her, and said, Get in, it's cold. Josie looked at the open car door. Then at him. That's not a thank you. That's me not wanting you to catch a cold. Griffin looked straight ahead. Get in the car, Josie. The first time he called her by her name. Not you, not Miss Mercer. Josie. She stepped into the car, sat in the back seat, and said nothing more. But she knew something had just changed. Small, but real. Lawson Merrick wasn't the kind of man who lost and then gave up. He was the kind who lost and changed the way he played. The council meeting had ended in a compromise. And to Lawson, compromise was like setting a mousetrap and leaving the cheese on top of it. It was only a matter of time before someone stepped on it. 1 week after the meeting, Lawson found the cheese. The Coronet Restaurant, at the corner of Ferry Dock Street and 6th Avenue, where Griffin held internal meetings every Thursday night with the district managers. The restaurant closed privately for Griffin from 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, and there were only 2 servers on duty, both of whom had worked there for more than 5 years and were trusted by Griffin enough that he didn't need anyone to check his food before he ate. Lawson found the weaker one of the 2, a 26-year-old young man who was 3 months behind on rent and had a sick mother who needed money for surgery. Lawson didn't threaten him. He paid him a lot of money, and with it came a small vial holding a clear liquid and instructions. Mix it into the first glass of water, Griffin ordered when he sat down at the table. Not much, not meant to kill him, just enough to give Griffin a high fever, make him lose control, and throw his heartbeat out of rhythm for a few hours. Enough to create an opening. And in that opening, Lawson would send men to the safe house. Thursday night, Griffin sat down at his usual table at the Coronet, ordered water, and took his first sip before all 3 district managers had arrived. The meeting lasted 1 hour. Griffin returned to the car, and Briggs drove. 15 minutes after leaving the restaurant, Griffin began to sweat. He unbuttoned the collar of his shirt, something he had never done in front of anyone. Briggs looked through the rearview mirror. "Are you all right?" Griffin didn't answer. His hand was trembling. Sweat ran down his temple. Then he leaned sideways against the car door, and his eyes lost focus. Briggs had been beside Griffin for 12 years. He had seen Griffin wounded, cornered, and betrayed, but he had never seen Griffin unable to keep his eyes open. Briggs didn't take him to the hospital. He couldn't. The head of the Blackwell organization couldn't appear in an emergency room with a foreign substance in his blood. There would be more questions than answers, and every question would be a bullet aimed at the organization. Briggs took Griffin back to the safe house, the only place secure enough, and the only place with the one person who could help. Josie was sitting in the main room when Briggs helped Griffin through the door. She heard the heavy, uneven footsteps, and when she looked up, she saw something she had never seen before. Griffin Blackwell couldn't stand steady. Briggs was supporting him with both hands. Griffin's shoulder slung over Briggs's shoulder, his feet dragging across the concrete floor. His face was deathly pale, sweat soaking through his shirt, his eyes half closed. Josie stood up immediately. Not Josie, the pregnant woman taking temporary shelter. Josie, the emergency nurse. She had switched modes before her conscious mind could even process it, like flipping a light switch. 1 second darkness. The next second, everything clear. "Put him down on the bed," she said, her voice clipped, emotionless. "On his side, not on his back. Get me a flashlight if you have one." Briggs laid Griffin on the bed. Josie knelt beside him, her pregnant belly touching the edge of the mattress. She checked the pulse at his wrist. Fast, irregular, skipping beats. She lifted Griffin's eyelid and shone the phone light into his pupil. Slow dilation, weak response. She placed her hand on his forehead. Hot, high fever, damp skin. "What did he eat tonight?" she asked Briggs, her voice quick. "Steak. Vegetables. Same as every week." "What did he drink?" "Water. 1 glass, at the beginning of the meal." Josie was silent for 2 seconds. Rapid pulse, dilated pupils, sudden high fever, cold sweat, loss of motor control. Not food poisoning. Food didn't cause symptoms that quickly, and it didn't cause pupils to dilate like that. There had been something in the glass of water. She had seen these symptoms in the emergency room, in patients whose charts she had marked as suspected chemical exposure, toxicology testing needed. "Someone put something in his drink," Josie told Briggs. "Not a guess. A certainty. I need salt, clean water, activated charcoal if you have it. Is there any in the bathroom medicine cabinet?" Briggs looked at her for 1 second. Only 1 second, then moved. He came back with salt, bottled water, and a small box of activated charcoal from the first aid kit in the warehouse. Josie mixed the solution, using a ratio she remembered from acute poisoning protocol. Not perfect, but enough, when there was no hospital, no equipment, nothing except 2 hands and 5 years of emergency care knowledge. She lifted Griffin's head and helped him drink in small sips. He swallowed with difficulty, half awake and half lost, his eyes opening and closing. Darcy came to the bedroom door. Without turning her head, Josie said, "Take Rascal and Duchess to the next room. Close the door. Stay there until I call you." Darcy nodded and went, without asking. All that night, Josie sat beside Griffin's bed on the concrete floor. She checked his pulse every 20 minutes, measured his temperature with her hand, watched his breathing. She wiped the sweat from his forehead with a wet cloth, replaced the cloth when it warmed, then wiped him again. And she talked, constantly, not because he could hear her, but because silence in a sick room was the thing she hated most in the world. Silence meant waiting. Waiting meant helplessness. And Josie Mercer didn't accept helplessness. She told stories. She talked about Mrs. Whitfield, whose blood sugar she checked every week, and who always scolded her because the needle was cold. She talked about Mr. Gentry, who always said, "Don't worry about me. I outlive cockroaches." Every time she changed his bandage, she talked about why she became a nurse. Not because she was noble, not because she wanted to save the world, but because when she was 19, she had gone to the emergency room after a bicycle accident, and the night shift nurse had held her hand for 4 hours while she waited for her scan results, and Josie had thought, I want to be the person who holds the hand. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Griffin began to talk in his fever. Most of it was broken, blurred, meaningless words, but there was one word she heard clearly, a name, Molly. He called it twice, in a voice that no longer sounded like anything she had ever heard from him. Not the voice of the man who ruled an empire, not the cold, even controlled voice. It was the voice of someone calling out to a person long gone. And in the fever dream, the distance between the present and the past had been erased. And he was back there, in the night he lost Molly, calling her in a voice he had buried deep for 20 years. Josie heard it. She didn't stop. She kept wiping away the sweat, kept checking his pulse, kept talking. She told one more story, any story, her voice steady and warm, filling the hollow space that the name Molly had just opened inside the room. Near 5 o'clock in the morning, the fever began to break. His pulse slowed and became steadier. The sweating eased. His breathing deepened. Josie sat against the wall, so tired her bones hurt, her pregnant belly heavy, her eyes burning from 6 hours without blinking. Griffin opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling, then he turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were clear, for the first time that night. His voice was hoarse. How long? 6 hours. He looked at her. Her hair was tangled, her eyes red, her pregnant belly in front of her as she sat on the cold concrete floor after staying there all night. You didn't sleep. You're still alive. I think that's a fair trade. Griffin said nothing for a few seconds. Then his hand moved across the mattress, found hers, and held it. 1 second. A light squeeze. Then he let go. Not the hand clasp of a lover or a grateful man, the hand clasp of someone who had just returned from a very far place and needed to touch something real to know he was still here. Josie didn't mention Molly. She knew he didn't remember calling his sister's name in the fever, and she would never tell him. Not because she wanted to keep a secret, but because there were moments when people reveal the deepest part of themselves without choosing to, and respecting that means keeping it quiet. She had heard him call for Molly, and she would carry that in silence, like carrying a letter the writer didn't know he had sent. Less than 1 hour after Griffin opened his eyes, while Josie was still sitting against the wall beside his bed, her eyes burning from 6 hours without sleep, Rascal began to growl. The dog was curled up in the corner of the next room where Darcy was sleeping, and his growl wasn't the kind he made when he saw the cat or wanted food. It was low, drawn out, rising from deep in his throat, the kind of sound an animal's instinct releases when it senses something wrong before people understand it. Then Duchess jumped down from the iron shelf. Josie had been here long enough to know that Duchess never jumped down from her shelf for any reason. That old one-eyed cat treated the iron shelf like a throne, and the ground like the territory of lesser creatures. If Duchess came down, it meant something was strange enough that even the queen had to leave her throne. Josie listened. Footsteps. Light. Deliberately light. Coming from the front gate. Not Briggs. Briggs had left 20 minutes earlier to check the security cameras at the head of the harbor after Griffin told him to. Not Darcy. Darcy was in the next room with Rascal. Not anyone who belonged here. Josie acted in 4 seconds. She stood, her pregnant belly pulling her center of gravity forward so that she had to brace one hand against the wall, then hurried into Darcy's room and shook her friend's shoulder. Darcy, wake up, now. Darcy opened her eyes, saw Josie's face, and became fully awake. She knew that face. Josie's face during an emergency. Go out the back door, Josie said, her voice low, quick, not repeating itself. Take the medicine bag with you. Go to the pier, turn left, and wait at the coffee stand on the corner. If I don't come out in 15 minutes, call Briggs's number from my phone. Darcy was already standing, already taking the bag, already pulling on her coat. She stopped at the door. What about you? Josie looked toward the room where Griffin was lying. He was still feverish, still weak, still unable to stand steady on his own. He can't get up, she said. I don't abandon patients. Darcy looked at her. She wanted to say something. Wanted to say Josie was insane, that she was 7 months pregnant, that this wasn't an emergency room and she wasn't a superhero. But Darcy had known Josie long enough to understand that when Josie said, I don't abandon patients, in that voice, there was no force in the world that could change her. Darcy nodded, gathered Rascal into her arms because the dog was growling and would give away their position, then disappeared through the back door. Duchess followed Darcy without needing to be told, because that cat had survived long enough in the world to know when it was time to leave a room. Josie stood alone in the hallway. Ahead of her was the entrance to the safe house. Behind her was Griffin's room. Between those two things, there was only her. She looked around. An iron rack stood against the wall, where repair tools were kept. She pulled out an iron pipe about 1/2 meter long, heavy enough to fit her hand, the kind used to connect water lines. She held it in her right hand. Her left hand, by instinct, settled over her belly. The baby inside her kicked once, lightly, as if he too were listening. The front iron door opened. A man stepped inside, big, taller than her by a head, dressed in dark clothes, his eyes sweeping the room quickly in the manner of someone trained to do it. Behind him, the shadow of a second man waited outside the door. The first man saw Josie. His eyes stopped on her pregnant belly, then stopped on the iron pipe in her hand. He looked as if he didn't know which piece of information to deal with first. Josie spoke. Her voice was low, even, steady. The voice she used with panicking patients in the emergency room. The voice that meant if she trembled, the person in front of her would tremble too, so she wasn't allowed to tremble. "I'm 7 months pregnant, and I'm holding an iron pipe. You should think very carefully about your next step, because I've got nothing to lose, and a great deal to protect." The man looked at her. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. He measured the situation. A pregnant woman, an iron pipe, a narrow hallway. He took one more step. Josie didn't move back. She tightened her grip on the pipe and looked straight into his eyes, and there was no fear in her gaze, only the absolute clarity of someone who had lost everything and had only one thing left to keep. Then, behind the man, from the darkness outside the door, Briggs appeared. He had turned back after receiving the warning from the camera system and had run from the head of the harbor in less than 3 minutes. Briggs didn't speak, didn't shout. He handled the second man outside first, fast, clean, silent. Then he stepped in and placed a hand on the first man's shoulder from behind. The man went rigid, lifted both hands, and didn't move again. The total time from the moment Briggs appeared until both intruders were lying still on the floor was less than 30 seconds. Josie was still standing in the hallway, the iron pipe in her hand, her pregnant belly before her heart racing, but her hand hadn't started shaking. Not yet. Footsteps sounded behind her, heavy, uneven, dragging across the floor. Josie turned her head. Griffin stood at the end of the hallway, one shoulder braced against the wall, his face as pale as paper, sweat still dotting his forehead. Somehow, he had pulled himself out of bed, somehow dragged himself down the hallway, and somehow remained standing by pure will, because it certainly wasn't by the strength of his body. His eyes were fully alert. He looked at Josie, looked at the iron pipe, looked at her pregnant belly, looked at the 2 intruders on the floor. Then he said, his voice hoarse from fever but calm as if he were commenting on the weather, "You're holding it wrong." Josie stared at him, unable to believe him. "You should be lying down. I'll teach you how to hold it properly, after I finish handling this." Griffin pushed his shoulder away from the wall and walked toward the warehouse next door, where Briggs had dragged the 2 intruders. He moved slowly, each step a small war against a body that was betraying him, but he moved. The warehouse door closed behind him. Silence. 15 minutes. Josie stood in the hallway, still holding the iron pipe, counting every minute in her head. She heard nothing from inside, not a sound, and somehow, that silence was more frightening than any scream she could have imagined. The door opened. Griffin stepped out. His face held no expression. His shirt was still clean. His hands were clean. There was no sign that anything physical had happened. He looked at Briggs. "Those 2 will leave the city before morning, and they won't come back." Briggs nodded. He didn't ask. Then Griffin turned to Josie, and what happened on his face in that moment was like someone turning off one light and turning on another. The cold went out. Warmth came on. His eyes softened, his shoulders lowered, and his voice became gentler than it had been 30 seconds before, as if these were 2 completely different men. "Are you okay?" Josie opened her mouth to say she was fine, and that was when her hand began to shake. Not when she faced the intruder, not when she held the iron pipe and stood guard in the hallway. Now, when it was over, when she no longer had to be strong, her hand trembled, the shaking spreading from her fingers to her wrist. up into her arm, and she hated it. Hated that she had just stood in front of a man twice her size without flinching. Yet now she was shaking because of 3 words. "Are you okay?" Griffin looked at her hand. He said nothing. He stepped closer, slowly, because his body still wasn't entirely his own, and placed both of his hands over hers, the hand still gripping the iron pipe. His hands were warm from the fever, larger than hers, and he only held on. Didn't squeeze, didn't pull, just held, until she stopped shaking, until the iron pipe in her hand became heavier than she could carry, and she let it slide down. He held on until her fingers loosened and her breathing steadied again. Then he let go, stepped back, and said nothing more. Josie looked at him, the man who had just dragged himself out of a sickbed into the hallway, who had just stepped into a closed room for 15 minutes with 2 intruders, who had just come back out with an expressionless face and clean hands, had then turned to ask her, "Are you okay?" in the softest voice she had ever heard from him. She didn't know whether she should be afraid or whether she should trust him. Maybe both. Maybe the answer mattered less than the simple truth. He got up for her, and she stayed standing for him. At the end of the hallway, Briggs leaned against the wall, silent. He had been beside Griffin for 12 years. He had seen everything, heard everything. But tonight, for the first time, he looked at the 2 people standing in the cold concrete hallway, one not yet free of fever, and the other 7 months pregnant. Both of them people who should not have gotten up, both of them still standing. And Briggs thought, this wasn't about his boss sheltering someone. This was 2 people keeping watch over each other, and he had never seen anyone keep watch over Griffin Blackwell before. Josie didn't forget that look. Out of everything that had happened since the night she fell into Ashford Bay, there were things she forgot. The face of the doorman at the restaurant, on the night of the council meeting, the name of the district manager sitting beside Harlan, the color of the clothes worn by the 2 men who broke into the safe house. But the look in the young woman's eyes, the woman standing behind Lawson Merrick that day, she didn't forget. She had seen that look too many times to forget it. In the emergency room at Ashford General, at 2 o'clock in the morning, on the faces of women who came in with bruises around their wrists and said, "I fell." At 4 o'clock in the morning, on the faces of young girls curled up in waiting room chairs, eyes lowered, shoulders drawn in, taking up as little space as possible, as if they had grown used to making themselves small, so someone wouldn't notice them. The look in Petra's eyes wasn't contempt. It wasn't curiosity. It was fear. The kind of fear that had been there for so long, it no longer looked like fear anymore. It looked normal, like breathing, like something she believed was life and that there was no other way. 2 days after the night of the safe house intrusion, when Griffin was able to stand again, and Briggs was tracking the source of the 2 intruders, Josie called Darcy into the room. "I need you to help me find someone." Darcy looked at her, her eyes narrowing in that familiar way. "Find her like a social worker, or find her like a detective?" Josie said. "Like a social worker. Her name is Petra, Lawson Merrick's assistant. I only know her first name. I don't know her last name, and I don't know her address." Darcy didn't ask why. She had been a social worker long enough to know when Josie had seen someone who needed help, and when Josie saw that, she wouldn't stop until she reached that person. Darcy took a day and a half. She called a few old contacts in social services, checked several public records, and found Petra's full name through the list of registered employees at a shell company Lawson owned. Petra Calloway, 30 years old. Registered address in the western suburbs of Ashford Bay. Darcy handed the information to Josie with 1 sentence. "Are you sure?" Josie nodded. Josie met Petra at a small diner outside the Harbor District, 20 minutes from the safe house by car. Briggs drove and waited outside in the car, his face expressionless as always. Josie went into the diner alone. It was small. 4 tables, smelling of cheap coffee and toast. Petra was already sitting in the far corner, her back against the wall, her eyes on the entrance, her hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't taken a single sip from. When Josie walked in, Petra looked at her as if she were looking at a bomb and didn't know whether it would explode. Josie sat down across from her. She didn't ask about Lawson, didn't ask about the organization, didn't ask about the night of the intrusion, or the council meeting, or anything involving Griffin Blackwell. She looked at Petra, looked into her eyes, and asked in the voice she had used thousands of times at a hospital bedside at 3 o'clock in the morning, gentle, slow, without judgment, the voice of someone saying, "I see you, and I'm here. Are you okay? Petra looked at her. She didn't answer. Her eyes changed, from guarded to confused, then from confused to something Josie recognized immediately. When someone asks the right question, the question no one has asked in a very long time, the first reaction isn't an answer. It's shock. Shock that someone saw. Shock that someone cared enough to ask. Shock because the question was so simple it had become a luxury. No one has asked me that, Petra said, her voice small. In 3 years. Josie didn't say, I'm sorry. She didn't say, I understand. She only sat there, silent, and waited. A good emergency nurse wasn't someone who always knew what to say. It was someone who knew when to be quiet, and Josie stayed quiet, with eyes that said, I'm not going anywhere. I'm sitting right here. You can speak when you're ready. Petra spoke. Not because she was forced, not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in 3 years, someone was sitting in front of her and looking at her like a human being, not like a tool, not like an assistant, not like something that belonged to someone else. She told it briefly, without going into detail, her voice flat in the way of someone used to telling the shortened version of her own story, because the full version was too heavy to say aloud. 3 years working as Lawson's assistant, 3 years living inside an orbit she hadn't chosen and didn't know how to leave. 3 years knowing too much with no one to tell. Then Petra leaned forward and lowered her voice. Lawson doesn't only want to overthrow Griffin, Miss Mercer. He's selling the organization's information to an outside rival. Every deal, every route, every name. He used you to stir up the council, to make everyone look at you instead of looking at him. You're the catalyst, nothing more. Josie listened, nodded, and showed no emotion. Do you have proof? Petra looked at her for 3 seconds. Then she opened the folder she had brought with her and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were copies of transaction records, dates, amounts, names of contacts outside the organization. Josie looked at the envelope, then at Petra. Why did you keep these? Petra looked down at her hands on the table. Because I knew there would be a day when I'd need them. I just didn't know who would be the one to ask. She looked up. I didn't think it would be a pregnant nurse sitting in a cheap diner asking me if I was okay. Josie looked at Petra. She reached across the table and took her hand. Not the handclasp of an ally, or someone recruiting another person. The handclasp of a nurse. The handclasp Josie had given thousands of times. In the emergency room. In the church basement. Beside sickbeds at 3 o'clock in the morning. With people the whole world had forgotten. When Josie was the only one still there. Petra looked at Josie's hand over hers. And for the first time during that meeting, her eyes turned red. Josie left the diner 15 minutes later. The envelope of evidence was in her coat pocket. Briggs opened the car door, looked at her, then at the pocket bulging slightly. He didn't ask. Josie got into the car and looked out the window. The little diner grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Inside, Petra was still sitting at the corner table, both hands around her glass of water. But this time, she took a sip. Josie didn't use force to get the evidence. Didn't use money. Didn't use power. Didn't use threats or negotiation or anything Griffin Blackwell's world would have used. She used 4 words. Are you okay? 4 words no one in this world bothered to say. Because in this world, no one asked that question sincerely. Josie asked sincerely, and it changed everything. Josie gave the envelope to Griffin that evening, after Briggs had gone back, and Darcy had fallen asleep. She placed it on the iron table in the main room, where he was sitting and reading something on his phone, and said, Petra Calloway, Lawson's assistant. She kept this for 3 years and gave it to me this morning. Griffin looked at the envelope, looked at Josie, then opened it. He read slowly, page by page, line by line, his fingers turning the papers without hurry, his face not changing expression. But Josie had been beside him long enough to recognize it. When Griffin read something truly important, his shoulders hardened, his jaw tightened, and he stopped breathing for about half a second between each page. He was doing all of that now. When he finished the last page, Griffin set the papers down, looked straight ahead, and said nothing for 1 full minute. Josie counted. 60 seconds. Then he said, his voice flat, You know what this is. It wasn't a question. Josie nodded. Proof that Lawson is selling the organization's information to an outside rival. Every transaction, every date, every name. She's the excuse. I'm the excuse. All of it is just a mask to hide what he's really doing. Griffin looked at her, then nodded. Then he picked up the envelope, stood, walked into the warehouse next door, and closed the door behind him. Josie didn't follow. She knew when someone needed to be alone. She went back to her room, lay down, and tried to sleep. Sleep didn't come. She lay there listening to the distant sound of waves from the bay. Rascal's steady breathing at the foot of the bed. Duchess softly sharpening her claws on the iron shelf. And she thought, Petra's evidence was clear, detailed, powerful enough to expose Lawson before the council. But Josie was smart enough to understand this too. If this evidence was presented publicly in front of 11 people in that meeting room, it wouldn't stop at the council. Information leaking outside the organization meant federal authorities would have a reason to investigate. And if the federal authorities got involved, they would turn over every brick. Safe houses, assets, people, and Josie, the nurse under investigation by the health department, living in the organization's safe house, the evidence in her hands, her fingerprints on everything. She would be pulled in. Her child would be pulled in, not as a victim or a witness, as someone connected. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Josie opened her eyes, not because of a sound, because of light. A thin streak of yellow light slipped through the crack beneath her bedroom door, coming from the warehouse next door. Griffin was still in there, 3 o'clock in the morning, and he still hadn't come out. Josie lay there for another 30 seconds, looking at the strip of light on the floor. Then she got up. She pushed open the warehouse door. Griffin was sitting at the iron table, the envelope of evidence spread open in front of him, both hands clasped together on the table, his eyes fixed on the empty space above the stack of papers. He didn't look up when she walked in. He knew it was her. Josie pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her pregnant belly touching the edge of the table. She looked at his face, the face of a man carrying something heavier than any shipment he had ever moved through the harbor district. "You're choosing between me and your chair," she said. Griffin looked at her. For the first time since she had entered the room, "Not my chair. Your safety. My safety. If I bring this before the council, everything breaks. Not just Lawson, the organization. And when the organization breaks, the federal authorities will step in. They'll find you, Josie. You're living in my safe house. You brought back the evidence. Your fingerprints are on everything. They won't look at you as a victim. They'll look at you as someone connected. And the baby." He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Josie looked at him, looked at his clasped hands, gripped so tightly the tendons stood out beneath his skin, looked at the stack of papers on the table, looked at the space between him and the decision he hadn't dared to make yet. "Let me tell you what I learned after losing everything," she said, her voice gentle, but not weak. "I lost my job, lost my home, lost my family, lost my reputation, lost my nursing license, lost everything I had built over 5 years in one afternoon." She looked straight into his eyes. "I'm still here. Losing everything didn't destroy me. Don't protect me by hiding the truth. That's what the hospital did to me. They hid me from the truth and called it protecting procedure. I swear I won't let anyone do that to me again. Not even you." Griffin was silent for a long time. Then he said, his voice lower than usual, as if he were trying to keep something from breaking open, "You know that if I bring out this evidence, everything becomes much more complicated for you." "I know. For the baby? I know. And you still want that?" "I want the truth. I've always wanted the truth. That's why I opened the clinic in the church basement, instead of closing my eyes and looking the other way at the hospital. That's why I climbed a fence at midnight to get medicine. And that's why I'm sitting here at 3 o'clock in the morning, telling you that I don't need you to hide me from the truth. I need you to respect me enough to let me decide for myself." Griffin looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. Once, firmly. Not the nod of a man agreeing because he had been convinced. The nod of a man who had just found what he needed in order to make a decision he had known from the beginning, but hadn't dared to make. Josie stood, pushed her chair in, walked toward the door, stopped, turned back to look at him. The man sitting alone in the concrete warehouse at 3 o'clock in the morning, with the stack of evidence that would change everything in front of him, and 12 years of building an empire through silence and control behind him. "Do you know what makes me trust you?" she said. Griffin looked at her, not because you jumped into the water, but because right now, at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're sitting here sleepless because you're afraid your decision will affect me. She paused. letting the next sentence fall exactly where it needed to. Truly terrible people don't lose sleep, Griffin. She walked out. The warehouse door closed softly behind her. Griffin sat alone. He looked at the papers on the table, looked at the glass of water she had left beside him without him realizing when she had placed it there. Then he looked at the door she had just walked through, and for the first time in a very long time, Griffin Blackwell knew exactly what he was going to do, not because of the evidence, not because of the organization, but because the 7-month pregnant woman had just sat across from him at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, "I don't need you to hide me from the truth," in the calmest voice he had ever heard, and he would never be the person who hid her from it. Never. Griffin called the council 2 days after that 3 o'clock in the morning in the warehouse. Lawson wasn't the one pushing this time. Griffin called it. When the head of the Blackwell organization called a meeting, no one asked why, no one refused, and no one arrived late. All 11 people were seated at the Coronet restaurant at 8 o'clock in the evening. The same room, the same long table, the same low-hanging lights, but the air was different. Last time, Lawson had called the meeting, and Griffin had been the one questioned. This time, Griffin sat at the head of the table, where Margot Hale had sat before, and Margot moved to his right without anyone needing to explain why. When Griffin Blackwell sat at the head of the table, everyone understood. This wasn't a discussion. This was a judgment. Josie arrived in the same car as Griffin. When the car stopped in front of the restaurant, Griffin got out first, buttoned his cuffs, then paused and looked at her, still sitting inside. "You don't need to come in," he said. Josie looked at him. "You weren't invited last time either," Griffin continued. Josie opened the car door and stepped onto the sidewalk. 7 months pregnant, wearing the coat Darcy had lent her and a new pair of shoes Griffin had provided. "No one stopped me last time either," she said. Griffin looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he turned and walked into the restaurant without another word, and Josie followed him, not needing to be invited. When the two of them entered the meeting room, the reaction was different from the first time. Last time, 11 pairs of eyes had looked at Josie as if she were a problem to be solved. This time, 11 pairs of eyes looked at her as if she were something they hadn't yet figured out how to classify. The pregnant nurse who had walked herself into a room full of bosses last time and walked out whole, and now she had returned beside the man in charge. Josie pulled out the chair beside Griffin, on his right, and sat down as if that had been her place from the beginning. Griffin didn't begin with words. He began with silence. He placed the envelope on the table, pulled out the stack of papers, straightened them neatly, then pushed them toward the center of the table. He didn't speak, didn't explain, only pushed. Then he sat back, both hands on the table, and waited. The person sitting closest picked it up, read it, then passed it to the next person. Page after page moved around the table like a stone thrown into a lake, ripples spreading across each face. Confusion, then understanding, then coldness. Lawson sat in the middle on the right side of the table, in his old seat. He watched the stack of papers pass from one hand to another, and with every second that went by, the smile on his face thinned by another layer. When the final page reached the last person, and 10 pairs of eyes turned toward Lawson, he was still smiling, but that smile now looked like a thin coat of paint on a wall about to collapse. "This is fabricated," Lawson said, his voice still smooth, still controlled. But Josie heard what she had been trained for 5 years in the emergency room to hear, breathing just a little faster than normal, the kind of fast most people wouldn't notice, but a nurse would. Griffin cut him off. He didn't raise his voice. He lowered it so much that Josie had to lean forward to hear, and if she had to lean in, so did everyone else in the room, which was exactly what Griffin intended, to make the entire room listen to him. Lawson. Just the name. A pause. Letting that name hang in the air long enough for everyone to taste it. "I'll give you 30 seconds to say the last meaningful thing you have to say." A pause. "After that, I speak. And when I'm finished, you will leave this room, leave this city, and leave anything that carries the Blackwell name." Another pause. "Not because I'm threatening you, because after everyone here hears what I have to say, no one will want to stand in the same room with you anymore." The room went silent. The kind of silence Josie had only heard once in her life. In the emergency room. In the second between the heart monitor's repeated alarms and the long, flat beep that came after. The second, when everything hung between staying and being lost. Lawson opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, closed it again. For the first time since Josie had met him, Lawson Merrick had nothing to say. Not because he had run out of words, but because he looked around the room, face by face, and understood no one in this room would stand with him anymore. The smile went out. Completely. Like a light cut off from power. 30 seconds passed. Griffin spoke. His voice was even emotionless, like a man reading a quarterly financial report. Every transaction, every date, every outside contact, every number. He didn't emphasize anything, didn't raise his voice at any point, didn't look at Lawson while he spoke. He looked at the council, one person at a time, and gave them the truth. Bare, precise, cold, leaving no room for doubt or defense. When he stopped, the room was so quiet that Josie could hear the clock on the restaurant wall, something she hadn't even realized was there until now. Then Harlan stood, the boss of the Southern District, the man who had called Griffin weak at the last meeting, stood, pushed his chair back, and turned his back on Lawson. He said nothing. Only turned his back. Then the person beside Harlan stood. Then the next. One by one, around the table, they stood and turned their backs. Josie watched it, and thought of dominoes. The first one fell, and each one after that fell because there was no other choice. Within 1 minute, Lawson Merrick was sitting alone in the middle of the long table, 10 people standing with their backs to him, and Griffin Blackwell seated at the head of the table, his face flat, his eyes forward. No need to say one more word. Lawson looked around the room, looked at the backs. Then his eyes stopped on Josie, the pregnant nurse sitting beside Griffin, the woman who had brought back the evidence, the woman who had opened everything. "You think you won?" he asked. His voice was no longer smooth, dry, hard. Josie looked at him calmly. "I'm not competing with anyone. I just don't accept lies." Lawson looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then he stood, buttoned his suit jacket with a hand that trembled slightly, and walked out of the room. No one watched him go. His footsteps on the wooden stairs grew smaller, then disappeared. The door downstairs opened and closed, then silence. Griffin stood. Meeting over. 2 words. Then he buttoned his jacket, nodded to Margot Hale, and walked out. One by one, the council members sat back down, looked at one another, looked at the empty place where Lawson had been sitting, and began to understand that what they had just witnessed wasn't only one man being exiled. It was a reminder of why Griffin Blackwell sat at the head of the table. Outside the restaurant, the Ashford Bay night was cold and damp. Josie stood on the sidewalk, breathing, her pregnant belly rounded beneath the streetlight. She waited. Griffin stepped out behind her 10 seconds later. He stopped beside her. And for the first time since she had known him, Griffin Blackwell's shoulders lowered. Not much. Barely an inch. But that inch was the distance between a man carrying something and a man who had just set it down. "Is it done?" Josie asked. "It's done." Josie reached out, took his hand. She didn't look at him when she did it. She looked straight ahead, toward the bay, toward the black water where he had pulled her up weeks before. Griffin looked down at her hand in his. Then he held it tighter, said nothing. They stood there, 2 people on the sidewalk, hand in hand, looking toward the bay. There was no need to speak. There are moments when words are the most unnecessary thing in the world. And this was one of them. Lawson Merrick left Ashford Bay on a Tuesday morning, with no one seeing him off and no one watching him go. He disappeared the way he had lived, quietly, cleanly, leaving no trace except the empty space at the meeting table that no one bothered to fill. Petra Calloway left the city 2 days later, by bus, with 1 suitcase and Josie's phone number written in her wallet. She didn't say where she was going. Josie didn't ask. Some people needed to disappear in order to begin again, and Josie understood that better than anyone. The organization's council settled back under Griffin's authority like water after a storm. No one mentioned Lawson. No one challenged Griffin. Margot Hale sent Briggs a short note confirming that Josie Mercer would continue staying at the safe house, with no time limit and no further review required. 2 lines. Enough. 5 days after the final council meeting, Griffin came to the safe house in the afternoon. It wasn't the hour he usually came. He usually came early in the morning or late at night, when the work was finished, when the harbor district was quiet, when he could sit in the corner of the main room and work in silence, while still knowing Josie was in the next room, safe. But today he came at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The late sunlight streamed through the warehouse windows, casting a golden strip across the concrete floor. Josie was standing in the yard, one hand braced on her hip, watching Rascal chase a dry leaf in circles around the concrete with a level of energy completely out of proportion to the size of his body. Duchess sat on the doorstep, her white and gray fur catching the sun, her one eye narrowed, watching Rascal with the expression of someone who had lived too long to find anything interesting anymore. Griffin stepped out of the car. Briggs parked and stayed inside. Griffin was holding a stack of papers inside a brown leather folder. Not organization files, not evidence, not anything related to Lawson or the council or any part of the shadowed world he controlled. He walked over to Josie, stopped 2 steps away from her, and held out the folder. Josie looked at the papers, then at him. "You brought paperwork." "Paperwork is more useful than flowers," Griffin said. "Flowers die after a week." Josie looked at him for another 3 seconds, the kind of look she had been using for weeks to read him, the kind he no longer avoided. "Are you trying to be romantic or practical?" "Both." No one said it was easy. Josie took the folder and opened it. She read, slowly, page by page. The first page, a withdrawal of the complaint from the State Health Department, filed by a representing attorney, signed, stamped, and effective. The investigation file was closed. Page 2, the reinstatement of her nursing license, effective immediately, with a confirmation letter from the licensing board. Page 3, an approved application for a legal community clinic, located in the East Harbor District, under the name Josie Mercer. Page 4, full health insurance for her and the baby, effective today. Josie finished reading the final page. She didn't look up right away. She looked at her name printed on the clinic application. Josie Mercer. Black ink on white paper. Official, legal, real. Her future lay in 4 pages. A license. A clinic. A clean path. The thing she had lost in one afternoon and hadn't dared believe she could get back. She looked up. Griffin stood there, his hands at his sides, his face expressionless, but his eyes had an expression now, clear to her for the first time. He was waiting for her reaction, and he wasn't sure. Griffin Blackwell, the man who could silence an entire meeting room with one sentence, was standing in front of her, uncertain. "All right," Josie said, her voice a little hoarse. Both worked. She stepped forward. 1 step. 2 steps. She set the folder on the doorstep beside Duchess. Then she placed her hand on the front of his shirt, over the place where his heart beat beneath the fabric, and kissed him. Not dramatic. No falling rain. No music swelling in the background. Just her lips on his, warm, certain. The kind of kiss from someone who knew exactly what she was doing and chose to do it. Her 7-month pregnant belly touched him lightly, and he didn't step back. He stood still, and after half a second, his hand lifted and settled gently against her back, drawing her just a little closer. Enough for her to know he was here. Enough for her to know he wasn't going anywhere. Rascal barked. One single loud, offended bark from the middle of the yard, because the 2 adults in his life were doing something that didn't include him, and that 5-month-old dog refused to be excluded from any activity. Duchess opened her eye on the doorstep, looked at Josie and Griffin kissing, then closed it again, with the only expression an old one-eyed cat could possibly make. Finally. Josie pulled away from his mouth. Not far. She stayed there, forehead close to his, her hand still resting on his shirt. Griffin looked at her, his eyes closer than he had ever allowed anyone to see. "You know life beside me will never be normal," he said, not as a warning, only as the truth, placed between them for her to decide. Josie looked at him. "My life has never been normal. I climb fences at midnight to get medicine for strangers. I fell into a bay while 7 months pregnant. I held an iron pipe and stood guard in a hallway for a feverish mob boss." She paused. "At least now there's someone to hold the iron pipe the wrong way with me." Griffin looked at her and smiled. For the first time, not almost a smile, not the corner of his mouth shifting 0.5 millimeter. A real smile, brief, small, unexpected, like water slipping through stone where no one knew there was a spring. The smile lasted less than 2 seconds before it vanished, but Josie saw it, and she knew she would remember it longer than anything he had ever said to her. Because Griffin Blackwell didn't smile. Everyone knew that. Briggs knew. The council knew. All of Ashford Bay knew. But Josie had just seen it. And it was like a door opening in a place where she had thought there was only a wall. Nearly 2 years later, Josie Mercer's clinic in the Old Harbor District was no longer the basement of an abandoned church or the corner of a renovated warehouse. It was the largest community health center on the east side of Ashford Bay, with 3 clinic rooms, 1 minor surgery room, a waiting area with cushioned chairs and air conditioning, and a sign out front that read, Mercer Clinic. Open to everyone, no fine print, no conditions. No, insured patients only. Everyone meant everyone, and Josie still held on to the meaning of that word, the way she had held on to it all her life. Josie was still a nurse, still worked night shifts, still didn't turn away anyone who knocked on the door at 3 o'clock in the morning, though now she had 2 other nurses on duty with her, and 1 part-time doctor she had recruited through a medical volunteer program. She had written the grant application for herself. Darcy managed administration, sitting at the reception desk with her old laptop, still muttering curses under her breath whenever the Wi-Fi acted up, still calling Rascal the unpaid security officer every time the dog ran around the waiting room demanding belly rubs from patients. And Petra Calloway, the woman who had left Ashford Bay with 1 suitcase and Josie's phone number, had come back 6 months later. She didn't explain why she had returned. She simply stood in front of the clinic one morning and said, "Do you still need volunteers?" Josie looked at her for 3 seconds, then handed her a blue medical coat and the assignment board. Petra now volunteered at the front desk, organizing files and guiding new patients. She spoke little, did a lot, and sometimes Josie caught her smiling when a patient said thank you. A small, unexpected smile, the kind that belonged to someone learning again how to believe she had value. Griffin Blackwell came to the clinic every evening, not because of work, not because of the organization, because he wanted to. He was still Griffin Blackwell, still controlled the East Harbor District, still the man no one dared mention by name after 10 o'clock at night. But every evening, starting around 7 o'clock, he sat on the floor of the clinic waiting room, his back against the wall, his legs stretched out, and let a baby girl 18 months old climb onto his legs. The baby, Josie's daughter, with curly brown hair and her mother's eyes, had a habit of climbing onto anything tall enough to climb, and to her, Griffin Blackwell was her favorite mountain. She pushed against his chest with her 2 tiny hands, and Griffin, the man who could make a meeting room of 11 mob bosses fall silent when he spoke, pretended to fall. Every time, never once missing it. He fell backward, the little girl laughed, he sat up, she pushed him again, and he fell again. The game repeated until she grew bored and moved on to pulling Rascal's ears. Rascal endured it. The dog was much bigger now than when he had been a few months old and curled up on Griffin's shoe, but he still endured having his ears pulled as if it were simply his part in this family. Duchess still sat on the highest shelf in the clinic. The old one-eyed cat had grown older, slower, but still refused to come down to the ground, still watched the world with the expression of someone who had seen everything and found none of it worth commenting on. The little girl pointed at Duchess and laughed. Duchess never laughed back. Their relationship remained in a respectful stalemate. Briggs stood outside the clinic every evening, keeping watch, arms folded across his chest, face expressionless. But sometimes, when he thought no one was looking, he pulled a small cookie from his coat pocket and gave it to the little girl when she ran out into the yard. One evening, Josie asked, "Where did the cookies come from?" Briggs looked straight ahead. "I don't know." Josie narrowed her eyes. "Did you bake them?" Briggs stayed silent for exactly 3 seconds, far too long for a denial. "I'm not answering that." Josie looked over at Griffin. Griffin looked at the ceiling. Darcy, from the reception desk, said just loudly enough to be heard, "The former soldier with the scar on his chin bakes star-shaped cookies for the baby. I could quit now because I've seen enough." No one confirmed it. No one denied it. Briggs kept standing outside the door, face expressionless, and the next evening, the little girl still had cookies. Josie Mercer wasn't saved because of destiny. She was saved because a stranger didn't walk away when he saw her drowning. And Griffin Blackwell didn't become a better man because of love. He became a man brave enough to let someone see the part of himself he had hidden most carefully. Sometimes, the person who saves you comes from the place you least expect, and sometimes, the person you save becomes the one who saves you. A person's worth doesn't lie in reputation, records, or titles. It lies in what they do when no one is watching, at midnight, in a church basement, or in the middle of dark water. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support us and share this video with the people you think need to hear it. How do you feel about Josie and Griffin's story? Please write your thoughts in the comments so we can hear what comes from deep inside your heart. Every comment you leave is the motivation that helps us continue bringing meaningful stories every day. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please subscribe now so you won't miss the next stories. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.